Welcome back. So glad you're here. This video is going to walk you through some ideas from a paper that I wrote some time ago. The paper was originally presented at a conference in Lille, France, at the I think it's a Catholic university there in Lille, one of the major, I think it was a private university there, so I'm pretty sure it was a Catholic one. But the original title of the paper was George MacDonald's Philosophy and C.S. Lewis, The Identity of Master and Student. It was subsequently published in a little short book on the philosophy and influences of C.S. Lewis, called Persona and Paradox, Issues of Identity for C.S. Lewis, His Friends and Associates, published by a little publisher called Cambridge Scholars Press. It's an academic-ish press, and they do they'll publish conference proceedings. So this is not to be confused with Cambridge University Press. It's a different press. But anyway, so I'm just going to read through this paper, walk you through some ideas from it, and say a little bit about why I think these ideas are important, and hopefully you'll find them helpful. So here it goes. C.S. Lewis identifies George MacDonald as his master. In his introduction to George MacDonald, an anthology, Lewis states that he's quoted MacDonald in every book that he's written. This paper that I'm presenting here to you will illustrate these philosophical connections and influence between MacDonald and Lewis in order to show Lewis's identity as a faithful student of his old Scottish master. I must warn you, I am not a Lewis scholar nor a MacDonald scholar, but I am a fan of each writer, and I consider each of these men to be my teachers. That doesn't mean I agree with everything they say. In fact, there's a lot of things that I don't agree with MacDonald and even Lewis on. But, right. Philosophical master and apprentice. There's a temptation to think of a philosophical work as a solitary enterprise. In some ways, like all intellectual work, it's something you have to do for yourself. Someone else can't do it for you if it's to be done well. This temptation comes from may come from reading philosophers like René Descartes in his Meditations. He had to enter his quote-unquote stove, this little silence pod, to start philosophy from scratch, all on his own. Philosophy is not always a solitary enterprise. When it comes to the great thinkers of philosophy, each of them has their own teachers, their mentors, and their guides. Socrates had the Oracle of Delphi to get him going in the right direction. Plato had Socrates admit in the Republic that when it comes to our education, we're all trapped in a dark cave of ignorance, waiting for someone to come down and lead us to the light. I went down, said Socrates. The first line of Plato's great work, and so he did. And Plato brought up Aristotle, each in turn descending and ascending, leading his intellectual child, student as a true pedagogue. Augustine speaks of this relationship of student to master in his Confessions. Here's Augustine. He said, "And to Milan I came, unto Ambrose the bishop, known to the whole world as among the best of men, to whom was I unknowingly led by thee, O Lord, that by him I might be knowingly led to thee. That man of God received me like a father, and looked with a benevolent and episcopal kindness on my change of abode. And I began to love him, not at first, indeed, as a teacher of the truth, which I entirely despaired of in your church, but as a man friendly to myself, and while I opened my heart to admit how skillfully he spoke, there also entered with it but gradually, and how truly he spoke." It's from Augustine's Confessions. So the relationship of identity between master and student has, I think, at least 5 features. I think there's 5 things that are part of the identity of master and student. First, there's an attraction, perhaps involving a kind of longing. Lewis, I think, uses a German word in some of his works called Sehnsucht. Sorry, my ancestors spoke German, but I don't verstehen Deutsch. Very bueno. Okay, so a longing, a Sehnsucht, searching for something more than what one already has intellectually or spiritually. Second, it involves a relationship of subordination, of a recognition of a proper order of things, including a recognition that one is ignorant, sometimes woefully so, And third, the relationship involves a leading out. Socrates, for example, thought of himself as a gadfly of the state, biting, stinging, and bringing into action those that he interacted with. He thought of himself as a midwife, drawing out knowledge from his students. So, fourthly, the relationship of master to student involves a transmission, a giving of oneself from teacher to student. It's an old form of educational relationship which differs from the factory model of education that's so often encountered today. For example, Lewis talks about this in his Abolition of Man. He says this: where the old forms of education initiated the merely new conditions. Let me say that again. The old forms of education, I'd call this the Socratic, the peripatetic, the way of the methetes, or the apprentice, the Hebraic notion of rabbi and students. I mean, Jesus does this with his disciples. The old form initiated. The new form conditions. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds, deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as the poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus or thus for purposes of which the birds know nothing. That sounds like your college experience. May God have mercy on us all. Okay, back to words. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation. Men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. It's a really nice distinction there. There's a distinction between propagation and propaganda. I think you don't have to think too hard about what that entails. Propagation versus propaganda. Propagation is giving of life, of part of yourself, to produce a new being, new person. Propaganda is just constructive. You're just taking raw material and fashioning it to your own purposes without regard for the other as other person. Okay. So let's review these four things or five things that this requires. First, the relationship between student and pupil, or student and learner, teacher and learner, or professor and student, or master and student, however you want to put it. There's an attraction. There's a subordination. There's a leading out, right? Drawing out, educare, drawing out. Fourth, there is the relationship involves transmission. And then lastly, it involves becoming like the master. For example, Jesus' disciples were to become like him as they identified with his life and teaching. So Dallas Willard, for example, gives an example of this, Jesus' way, as a form of apprenticeship. Willard states this, quote, I like the word apprentice because it means I'm with Jesus learning to do what he did. When you look at the first disciples, that's what they were doing. They watched him, they listened to him, and then Jesus said, now you go do it. It's from one of Willard's works, 2005. This apprentice is essentially normative and teleological. It involves an organic, progressive unfolding of what we are now to what we ought to be. It's similar to what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The Greek word for perfect here in this passage is telos. If you've been studying philosophy sometime, you know that the notion of telos is goal-directed, a fulfilling activity. We are to become completely what we are intended to be as students, with respect to our teachers. This relationship between a longing, subordinated student desiring to be led from ignorance to insight is one that is full of love, joy, and hard work. Young birds don't learn to fly in a day. The relationship need not occur with someone who's also physically present. Okay, let me back up here. So, a couple things. The relationship here, in addition to those five things, involves hard work and time. And it's also possible, for our purposes in terms of our own education, to identify with a master who is either living or maybe even no longer living. You can have as your teachers someone with whom you've had no physical contact. And similarly, you might have a master who has been long dead. Now, in the case of C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald, there's something to be said here. MacDonald died on September the 18th in 1905, just before C.S. Lewis's 7th birthday. So MacDonald dies and Lewis is 6. So they overlapped a few years, right? 6 years of overlap. And Lewis could have learned something from the old man had they met prior to MacDonald's death, but probably not very much as a 6-year-old, although I'm sure that Lewis was a smart young lad. So it's not physical proximity that's essential to the identity of master and student, but it's a loving submission to be guided to what is good, true, and beautiful, all the while becoming more and more like the master. And that's exactly what happened with C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald. So thanks for listening. I'll have another video that talks a little bit about the philosophical influence of MacDonald on Lewis. As a philosopher, I'm not going to talk much about their literary influence, but something about the transmission of ideas, especially philosophical ideas. There's another video on that. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.